All right, so here's everything that we're gonna need to do a brake job on a Mazda CX-5. So here are all the tools that we're gonna need. So depending on whether you're doing the front or rear, you'll need your rear or front brake pads. They are specific, so make sure you be careful to get the right ones. Then in terms of tools, you're going to want a ratchet and then some extensions if need be. A breaker bar is good for getting the lug nuts off. I also like an open end or a regular wrench, 14 millimeter. This is for the brake caliper bolts. 14 millimeter socket, and then a 21 millimeter socket for the lug nuts. You're also going to want a torque wrench. I have two. This one here is good for up to 150 foot-pounds, so for lug nuts. And then I like this thin one here. This is a 3/8 inch drive torque wrench, and this one here goes only up to 80, but it's good for doing the brake caliper bolts because it has a really thin head. So I like this one here. And then for the rear, they do sell a specialty tool, but I found that this is a pin spanner for changing out bits on an angle grinder. This allows you to twist the brake pad caliper, the piston back in. But they do make a specialty tool that you can borrow from O'Reilly or AutoZone for free, so you can always pick that up. But I didn't want to make the trip, and I found that this worked for me, so this is an option. Otherwise, get the specialized tool. And then you're going to need some brake part grease or lubricant for the pads, as well as the slide pins. And then finally, you're just going to need your basics: some wheel chocks, some jack stands, and floor jack. Let's get into it. All right, so the first thing we need to do is to loosen up the lug nuts while the car is still on the ground. So go ahead and grab your 21 millimeter socket, loosen those lug nuts up, and then we can go ahead and jack it up using this rear jack point, as you can see where I have my hockey puck. Make sure you use this jack point and not anything else, as it is the correct one to use. You can then use it to raise both rear wheels at the same time, lifting the car off the ground. Once you have the car lifted, you can then go ahead and slide your jack stands under the pinch welds on each side of the car. Make sure those are properly positioned, and then you can go ahead and lower the car back down onto the jack stands. Once we have that done, we can go ahead and place some wheel chocks under the front wheels just to make sure the car won't roll away from us. And then we can go ahead and remove the lug nuts the rest of the way and pull the wheel off. Now, for added safety, I like to put the wheel under the car just to give me an extra layer of security in case something were to happen. This is obviously optional, but highly recommended. And then you can go ahead and grab a 14 millimeter. I like to use a wrench just to loosen up the caliper bolts. They can be on there pretty tight. So using your wrench, go ahead and loosen those up. And then you can remove them the rest of the way using a ratchet. Once we have our caliper bolts removed, it's important to release the park brake, because otherwise we won't be able to get the caliper off since it'll be engaged. Go ahead and remove the caliper and lay it to the side, making sure not to stretch out the caliper hoses. We can then go ahead and remove the old brake pads. They should just slide out as such, and we can then go ahead and start the process of replacing them. Make sure to remove the old brake hardware from the caliper as well, as this is going to be replaced with the new one. It should come with your new brake pads. As you can see here, my old brake pads were really rather worn just by the comparison of the thickness of the old one and the new one, so these are definitely needing to be replaced. And within your brake pad box, you should find the new hardware, which you're then going to go ahead and install onto your caliper. It's always a good idea to use some brake part lubricant on your brake pads before installing them. So I like to put a little bit on the back where it's going to make contact with the piston, just to make sure it doesn't stick. Again, make sure to be very careful not to get any on the actual braking surface. And then a little bit on either end where it's going to make contact with the brake pad hardware. You're then going to go ahead and just slide these back into the caliper, and these should fit in relatively easily. Go ahead and repeat the same process on the other brake pad. Again, a little bit of lubricant on the back side and then on the little tongue, if you will, on either side, and then just go ahead and slide it into the hardware. All right, now we need to go ahead and push the piston back into the caliper. Now there is a special tool for this, which I'm not using. I'm actually using something from my angle grinder. It's the wrench for the angle grinder, but basically you just need to twist it while turning the little fingers. So they do make a tool that essentially fits in perfectly into the actual piston. You can borrow it from O'Reilly or AutoZone, but if you have a angle grinder wrench like I'm using here, it works perfectly fine and it saved me a trip from the store. Either way, the tool itself, you can just rent it for free, but if you don't want to go out to the store, this worked really well for me. Once you have the piston pushed all the way back into the caliper, we should then re-grease our caliper slide pins. So go ahead and clean those off, add some more brake parts lubricant onto the slide pins, and then go ahead and spread the grease all around the slide pins before reinserting them into the caliper. Now we can go ahead and put our caliper back over the brake pads and the rotor itself. You may need to sort of push down the caliper slide pin boots a little bit to get the caliper to slide on. And then once you get everything lined up, you can go ahead and thread your caliper bolts back in. We're then going to go ahead and use our 14mm socket and a ratchet to snug these two bolts back down before breaking out the torque wrench to torque them down to the proper 24 foot-pound torque spec. Once we have everything torqued back down to spec, we can go ahead and reinstall our rim. We can go ahead and snug down the lug nuts using either a ratchet or, as I'm using here, an impact driver. And then once the lug nuts are snug down, we can go ahead and drop our car off the jack stand. So lift the car back up using your floor jack, remove the jack stands from either side of the car, and then you're just going to lower it back down to the ground. Once you have the car back on the ground, you can go ahead and torque down the lug nuts to the proper torque spec, which is 80 to 108 foot-pounds, and we're all done. Thank you for watching. I hope this helped.